Dottie,
Hi, Dawn.
and welcome everybody back to Harbor Online Community. We're here to recap our third Thursday night in our series on faith in the wilderness. And Dottie brought us to another stage of Hagar's story. It's our last week looking at the story of Hagar. So, Dottie, do you want to tell us a bit about what you shared with us?
Yeah. Yeah, so this was our third week looking at Hagar. And we have a running joke in Harbor. All of us have been taught to say it in different ways, and all of us have Googled, and part of the fun of it is no, who knows actually how to say her name. So there's Hagar, Hagar, we're all just saying different things. But I say Hagar. So we have been looking at Hagar, who is kind of this figure in the Old Testament that really has been skipped over in the story of Abraham and Sarah. And she appears in Genesis 16 and is introduced to us as an Egyptian slave to uh, Abram and Sarai. But or Abraham and Sarah, as they're later called. And she is mistreated by them. She is used to have Abraham's child. So there is just a very violent relationship. We don't know what she consents to, but Abraham gets her pregnant. Sarah is jealous, and so she flees to the wilderness. And the first week of her story, we looked at her fleeing and regaining some agency. And then the second week, we looked at later in the story, her surviving with Ishmael in the wilderness. And then this week, we looked at back to the beginning of the story. The first time she goes to the wilderness, she's fleeing, and what happens when she gets to the wilderness. And we explored three main themes in Genesis 16, 7 through 14. We looked at the questions that God asked her, God speaking to her, and her naming God. And so the questions that God asked were, where have you come from and where are you going? Which is a sign that we are in the wilderness. Is she responds, she knows where she's come from, but she doesn't know where she's going. The second thing was God speaks to her. And we talked about the significance that is she the first person to be spoken to in the wilderness by God? This is really significant for her. This like Egyptian woman and a slave, like so marginalized and such a loaded identity that she's the one that God speaks to. And then finally, we talked about how she gives God a name, and it's a name that's the first time we see it, and it's the El Roi, the God who sees me, and how significant that name is, that Hagar is the one who has agency as she flees to the wilderness, who has been oppressed in so many ways, flees to the wilderness, in the wilderness says, I don't know where I'm going, but God is speaking to her. God is divinely affirming who she is, and she names God. And it is just so powerful that she is the one to give God this name, God, the God who sees me. And so those were the three main things we explored. This is such a multifaceted text, and none of us will really able to do it justice. There's so much there. And then, of course, what I forgot to say is the last 3 weeks, we've been approaching this text through womanist theology. And womanist theology centers the experience of Black women. And in biblical studies like this, womanist theology is centering Hagar in the story, not Abraham or Sarah, but centering her. So there's a lot there, and it's so rich. Yeah.
Yeah, it was so rich. Your presentation, and of course we had some insights from one of our community members who has studied these texts under a rabbi for many years and is a well-regarded teacher, and we're just so grateful to have Larry Houck in our community. Um, I wonder, one of the questions you asked um, was, what is the significance of Hagar being an Egyptian slave and being the first one to name God, and the first one that God speaks to?
Mm.
And I just wonder if you have thoughts on that significance for you or for the world or for the church.
Mm. Yeah, I was first introduced to the story through this type of lens in my first semester of seminary. And it was maybe month one of moving across the country that I live in and landing in a new state and learning about this story in my Hebrew Bible class and hearing it from this type of perspective where she's at the center. And I was so moved. And I think it really helped set the tone for how I would do biblical studies. That to see that this outsider, and previously when I heard about her story, um, she is really this minor figure, and it's all about Sarah and Abraham and their dynamics. And are they faithful to God? Are they not? And really caring about the two of them. And yet, as we've talked about them, their actions have had really, really harsh consequences on the life of Hagar. And so by recentering her story, it has helped me reorient how I look at the Bible and who I'm looking at in the Bible. And so to have someone that I've skipped over, I've read that story, gosh, I don't even know, probably 100 times at least before coming to it with this perspective, and to have it be, wow, she is actually the hero of the story, as someone said in our discussion group, is so moving. As a woman, I find a lot of inspiration in that, okay, she's the hero. But also as she's an Egyptian and experiencing multiple levels of systemic oppression, I look to other people in our society and that are also experiencing similar marginalization. And I go, wow, this is a moment, again, as womanist theology teaches us to center the experiences of marginalized people and to really take seriously what they've gone through, but more importantly, what do they have to, like, what do people have to teach us? And like, what do all of us have to learn from one another? Yeah, it's really powerful and beautiful.
Yeah, I hear you about um the more I think as church and Christians talk about um reaching to the margins, I think the challenge is the further we go into the margins, especially as white folks or people from dominant religious traditions, the further we go into the margins, the more we have to stop talking. And we hear stuff that makes us uncomfortable and might actually be an affront to how we've been doing things. And but those voices are so important.
Yeah.
As I was telling you, I got to nerd out a bit about naming. My Some of the research I'm doing right now is around Genesis 2 and the vocation that God gives to human beings in that call, and particularly about being participating in creation. But it got me thinking about how God asks the human to give the animals a name.
Hmm.
And as I do, and I think as some of us do in our discussion groups, I kind of rambled on a bit. And as I thought about that, that it's God, it's almost hierarchical, right? Like God goes to human, human gets the right to give animals, plants names. And then after Abraham and Sarah, there's Moses who like almost has to beg God for a name, right?
Hmm.
At the burning bush, God's like, no, like I'm God. And Moses is like, no, but really? Like, no one's gonna believe me. And then God's like, oh yeah, language. Right. Humans have language. Okay, call me I am.
Hmm.
And this story is so different from
Yeah.
both of those.
Mhm.
that she is so, to me, she is so connected to her divine humanity
Yes.
that
Mm.
that importance of naming and being seen, as one person said, it's an act of gratitude as well to gift
Yeah.
God a name.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good word. She's so connected to her divine humanity. And at Harbor,
Mm.
we've talked a lot about how women as theologians have been such a huge pillar for us in our learning,
Absolutely.
and women of color. I do think that women as theologians and women of color that are approaching the Bible are connected to their divine humanity in a way that's like leading the charge for us to reimagine church and faith. Yeah, it's just, yeah, yeah. Gosh, a good way to say that about her, Dawn. That's
Thank you.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and I the challenge that I walked away with, not a challenge, just I guess a reflection, um, was what do I feel comfortable giving God a name? And what names do I give God? And some of us said, we use titles, we use Lord, we use Holy One. And some people said, I use a verb, right? I use love as a verb to refer to God,
Mhm.
um, which is such a beautiful relational way to be with God.
Yeah. Our group, if you want
Mm,
a little bit more
yeah.
about the groups, yes. Our group, we had Larry in our group. And for those of you that know Larry, it's the person that Dawn was referring to earlier that is kind of our in-house Hebrew scholar, which is very fun. And Larry helped us go into the weeds of more of the context, more of the ancient Hebrew. And we talked about the wilderness and how the
Mm,
wilderness is not a bad place. Um, and he said something along the lines of the wilderness is a good place, but not a place to stay. And we kind of wrestled back and forth with how the wilderness, quite literally, like if I am to go out on a hike in the wilderness, that is often the place I hear God and I connect with God in the divine. And that's true for many of us. Like the wilderness, the physical wilderness or nature is where we connect to ourselves and God deeper. So there is that significance. And then also for us, though, in the metaphorical way of talking about the wilderness can be very disorienting. It can be a place of, okay, I know where I've come from. For us in the church land, a lot of us have left religious spaces. We know where we've come from, but we don't quite know where we are going. And that is deeply destabilizing at times. And so with this wilderness, metaphor, we kind of talked about how there's a push and pull of it, where there's something that's quite adventurous and exciting about being in the wilderness, but there's also a sadness about we've had to leave something to get here. And what are we leaving? And do we even have a sense of where we're going? Yeah, and I shared with Harbor last night, not necessarily in my faith, but in my like family landscape and some of the things that we are navigating. Like we kind of feel like we're in the wilderness of like, where are, like my husband and I like often kind of laugh and go like, where are we going? Like there is a lot about this analogy. I think that's resonated with me more than I anticipated, at least.
yeah. Even if we are not in the wilderness right now, I think just talking about it brings us right back to one of those times when we were there. The other blessing of the wilderness that some of our folks named was the wilderness is where we find each other.
Mm,
And, speaking specifically about Harbor, but also just where you find other lost, wandering people. Um, the wilderness can be lonely. We can be the only one there, but not always.
mm,
Sometimes we find the people who we need to find.
mm. That's beautiful. Yeah.
So we are now halfway through our series. Hard to believe. Gosh, Lent never, it always goes by too fast. I like anticipate it and I'm like, oh my gosh, Lent is so much work. Oh my gosh, there's so much to do. And then we're halfway through already.
Yeah.
So in the next 3 weeks, we're going to be shifting into the story of Jesus in the Gospels and looking at wilderness themes in the Gospels. Um, so I hope everybody can join us. Dottie, thanks again for wrapping up this first part of our series in such a great way.
Well, thanks, Dawn. It's been really fun.